And it's fascinating to me that this, was Jesus God, is a big question today. And it would be fun to track down all of the ways that this question is asked and all of the reasons and presuppositions behind the asking of this question. I'm of the opinion that there's a good way to ask the question, and if there's a good way to ask the question, then it's reasonable that there are bad ways to ask the question. Well, what would some of the bad ways be to ask this question? Well, first of all, taking a philosophy that would be alien to the first century Jewish mind and forcing that philosophy onto the writings of first century Jews. That would be a bad way to arrive at this question. For example, a deist. Now, it's not that deism is new. Deism is the brainchild of Epicureanism, and Epicureanism was alive and well in the first century. But the authors of the New Testament were not Epicureans. And therefore, to approach the text as a deist, I don't think you're going to find what the text is saying. Another one would, of course, be modernism. If you're going to approach the text with modernism, you're going to be looking for things that aren't there because that's not how they thought. At least with postmodernism, and it's the only plus I could think of, at least with postmodernism, you're supposed to be aware of your presuppositions. And you're supposed to try and overcome your presuppositions. But I'm also of the opinion that the church, and I'm primarily speaking of the Western church, has not answered this question rightly. I think they've offered an answer, and I don't think that that answer has been wrong, but I'm not sure that that answer has been complete. And so today, I want to address that. Now, if you were a guest with us this morning, and you were to pick up our welcome packet, our welcome packet includes a document. It's the What We Believe. It's a doctrinal statement. You can also find it on our website. And there, you're going to find a declarative statement. And that declarative statement is going to indicate that we at Christ Church of the Valley believe in the deity of Christ. That is, we believe that Jesus was God. And following that declarative statement, you're going to find references to New Testament passages. Now, somebody could accuse us of proof texting in that case. What a proof text is when you take a passage from the Bible and you use it to prove something, and you're not terribly interested in the context of the passage that you're taking. You're just using that text to prove your position. But I would argue that that's not inherently a bad thing when it comes to a faith statement because of the nature of the document. The document itself is not meant to be a complete and total, it's not meant to be a treatise on the subject. It's meant to answer your question very quickly. But I do this morning want to go beyond proof texting, and I want to touch on what I believe is a heart of the issue. And that would be, what are the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What are they? And I want to make a distinction between what is the Gospel, and that of course would be the good news of Jesus Christ, versus what are the Gospels? What are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? What are they meant to be? What did the author intend for it to be? Well, unfortunately, I think the Western Church has offered them up as standalone documents. Here, read the Gospel of John, and then you'll get to the good parts, and you'll understand why Jesus came and so forth. Or read Mark, and then read Romans, get into Paul, and let Paul explain New Testament theology to you, Romans and Galatians and so forth, and then you'll get the whole thing, and you'll be all right with just that. Well, the problem with that is I don't think that the Gospels themselves indicate that they're meant to be standalone documents. How do I come to that conclusion? Well, we look at the beginning of our first gospel in our New Testament. That would be Matthew. Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 begins with Jesus the Messiah, mentions him being the son of David and the son of Abraham. Now, if this was the beginning of the story, then every hand in the audience should go up and say, what is a Messiah? And why would that be important? And again, if this is the beginning of the story, we should also ask, who's David and who's Abraham and why are those important? Before we finish Matthew chapter 1, we're going to have a quotation in verse 23, a quote from the book of Isaiah. And again, if this was the beginning of the story, we would once again have to go, wait a minute, why are we quoting some ancient book called Isaiah? What would it have to do with this if this is the beginning of the story? But Matthew is not unique in this, because if we turn to Mark chapter 1, verse 2, we're also going to again have a quote from the book of Isaiah. So Mark is assuming that his story is not the beginning. It's the beginning of the part about Jesus, but there's details and there's things that happened before the time of Jesus. Luke begins his gospel talking to some Greek person, Theophilus, and he's talking about what's going on in the Greco-Roman world, but by verse 6, he starts to talk about a temple, he starts to talk about priests and all this stuff. And once again, before we get done with Luke chapter 1, an angel is going to make a reference to somebody coming in the spirit of Elijah. Which should once again, if this is the beginning of the story, what would it mean for somebody to come in the spirit of Elijah? And again, he is going to quote the prophet Malachi. Finally, John begins with, of course, in the beginning, which those of us familiar with it should realize that John just used the exact same phrase that we find at the beginning of both the Hebrew Bible and the English Bible in the book of Genesis, in the beginning. And so, the Gospels are not the beginning of the story, they're a continuation of the story. Continuation of what story? They're a continuation of the story of God and God interacting with His good creation. So that should then prompt another question. Well, where are we at in the story? That we're now entering the narrative concerning His Son, Jesus Christ. And where does this fit into the overarching narrative? Well, obviously this morning I'm going to have to be brief. I do want us to know where we are in the story before we attempt to answer the question, what are the Gospels? Of course, the story begins with God, and it begins with God creating. And He creates our time, space, matter universe. And when He is almost done with His creation, He, God, enters the creation in a very unique way. He creates man and woman to be His image bearers in His good creation. That's where our story begins. And of course things go awry in Genesis chapter 3 through human rebellion and human will. And we start to get a bit of a fuddled mess. And that mess goes from Genesis chapter 3 through Genesis chapter 11. And there we see man trying to usurp God. Man saying that I'm going to determine right and wrong, and I'm going to decide for myself what I'm going to do, and things like that. And we get this mess. And then Genesis chapter 12 begins with this new idea, this new concept. God is going to interact specifically with a person, and this would be Abraham. At the time of Genesis chapter 12, his name is still Abram, but, his name will eventually be changed to Abraham. And again, I'm afraid that too often in the Western church, we've taken Genesis 1 through 3, so Genesis, the beginning, the creation, everything is good, and then chapter 3, everything goes awry, and we've stopped there, and we've skipped ahead to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we've offered up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the answer to Genesis chapter 3. And it is. But it's the answer to Genesis chapter 3 through the rest of the story. It's the answer to Genesis chapter 3 through Genesis chapter 12 and 13 and so on. And there we see God saying that he's going to interact with this person called Abraham, and the covenant with Abraham is going to be a major motif both through the rest of the Old Testament and into our New Testament. What's interesting is when we read about this covenant and we read about this story, it seems like the narrative easily gets distracted, easily gets off task, but then it's brought back on task. And we think, okay, now it's going to go to fruition and so forth. But by the end of Genesis, we have the covenant people, the people that God's going to use to bless the nations. We have them in Egypt. But then we start the next book, Exodus, and suddenly the covenant people are enslaved. Well, how are the covenant people going to bless the nations? How is God going to work through these people if they're enslaved in Egypt? But that is the backdrop for the next part of the story. And the next part of the story would be, of course, a God who interacts with his creation to rescue, to redeem, to forgive, and to dwell amongst his people. I want you to repeat that. I want you to catch that. A God who rescues. A God who redeems. A God who forgives and dwells amongst his people. And we haven't even gotten to the New Testament yet. God uses God uses Moses to establish his covenant with the people and to dwell amongst the people. That would be in the form of the tabernacle. God is going to tabernacle amongst his people. And you can read about God's presence being present amongst his people in the tabernacle in Exodus chapter 40 verse 34. The tabernacle is eventually going to give way to the temple. Solomon is going to build the temple so that God can dwell amongst his people. And when the temple is dedicated in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 14, the presence of the Lord so fills the temple that the priests can't even do their assigned duties. So that sounds like a great place then for God to interact through his people to the nations and to bring the nations into his way of doing things, right? But through continuous rebellion and the people chasing after their own gods, we come to a place where God gives the people over to their desires. And he abandons his temple. He's no longer going to dwell amongst his people. You can see this in Ezekiel chapter 10, beginning in verse 18. The presence of the Lord goes up from the Holy of Holies and works its way out of the temple and works its way out of Jerusalem and leaves. God is no longer dwelling amongst his people. His people have rebelled. His people have not obeyed. And God is now going to give his people the desires of their hearts. You don't have to be my people. You don't have to obey me. Here's what happens when you go your own way. His people go into exile. And it's in the exile that they begin to read the prophets, these people, these spokesmen for God, who have been warning them this whole time, and who have been telling them what's going to happen if they continue in their rebellious ways. I wish that we could look more in detail at this, because the prophets are absolutely full about what the exile is and how the people will return from exile. So just to point to a couple things, Isaiah chapter 10, a remnant will return. Isaiah chapter 2, the Lord, God Himself, is going to rule in Zion. And the nations are going to come to Zion to know and to interact with the God of Israel. Isaiah chapter 40 and on, and this is terrific stuff. It's the Lord Himself who's going to come. Jeremiah chapter 24, the Lord tells them that the Lord's eyes are now going to be on the captives in Babylon. And one day He's going to bring them back. And He's going to enable them to serve Him with their whole hearts. And Ezekiel chapter 43 promises that one day the Lord is going to return to His temple, and He's going to rule forever, and He's going to dwell amongst His people. And so what happens? Some of the Jews return from exile. Some of the Jews come back from exile. And they dwell again in the land. And they think the exile must be over, because the Lord said that a remnant is going to return. So this must be the time that we've been reading about in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Ezekiel, and in the other prophets. And so eventually they get a temple built. And they look at each other and go, this must be it. But you can read the post-exilic writings, that is Ezra and Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and there's no indication that the presence of the Lord has returned. There's no indication that that's what's going on. And in fact, you can even see this again in those exilic writings, that the Lord doesn't seem to be ruling from Zion. And the people are not serving Him with their whole heart, and the Lord doesn't seem to be returned. And in fact, Nehemiah points out in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 36, that although they've returned to the land, they are slaves in the land. And that's where our Old Testament is about to end. But in God's final words in our Old Testament, the final messenger, Malachi, he leaves this, saying that He will send His messenger on ahead of Him. And this is very important to know if you're going to read the Gospels and understand them. God says, I'm going to send my messenger on ahead of me to proclaim my way, and suddenly the Lord Himself is going to return to His temple. And that's where our New Testament begins. Is the exile really over? And will the Lord return to His temple? And it's with that background, it's with that information that we begin to read the Gospels. But interestingly, the Gospels don't just want to tell you. They want you, in a way, to come along. Enter into the story the same way we've already kind of entered into the story of the Old Testament. We had to do it quickly, obviously, for time's sake. But the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, want you to enter in. And they want you to see what the next part of the story is. And in one sense, they want you to kind of be the 13th disciple. They don't want to just tell you the answers flat out, straight up. They want you to join oftentimes the disciples. I'm going to highlight one particular story, one particular event. There are several of these in the Gospels, but there's an episode, it happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus and the disciples are out on the boat, and they're out on a boat in the water, and Jesus has fallen asleep, and a storm has come up. And the wind and the waves are against the boat, and the boat is beginning to swamp, and they wake up Jesus and they say, "Don't you care that we're about to drown?" And Jesus wakes up and says, "I'm the Messiah, don't worry about it, go about your business." And he goes back to sleep, right? Except that that's not what happens in the story. What happens in the story is Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind and the waves, and they obey him. And what do the disciples say? They see this man controls the wind and the waves. Who is this guy? Who is this guy that can do such things as control the wind and the waves? These are powers, these are attributes, not of a regular person, not of just any man, but of Yahweh. And that's a bit of the question then in their tone. Who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey him? And so that is where we enter the Gospels. We join them in the story. When the writers want you to see specific things, such as Jesus healing the blind, Jesus healing the deaf, Jesus healing the lame, Jesus healing the mute. And at that point I would like to draw your attention to Isaiah chapter 35, because there the Lord himself is coming. And when the Lord comes, guess what he's going to do? He's going to heal the blind. He's going to heal the deaf. He's going to heal the lame. He's going to heal the mute. The answer is there if you want to follow the narrative, if you want to join the story. But there are some people who just don't want to join the story. They want a blatant answer. They want to know. And Jesus will meet those people, I think. I want to join an episode going on, Mark chapter 14, after Jesus has already been arrested. Jesus is put before the Sanhedrin. And in this episode, the Sanhedrin has these two witnesses. And these two witnesses are testifying against Jesus. But the two witnesses, it said, can't agree. Their testimony can't agree. And because their testimony can't agree, the Sanhedrin can't condemn Jesus. And I imagine Caiaphas, the high priest, is getting agitated and he's getting more and more irritated. His stress level is going up by the moment. And so he says to Jesus, "Aren't you going to answer these charges?" Caiaphas knows that Jesus is not under obligation to answer these charges because the witnesses don't agree. If the witnesses don't agree, then Jesus doesn't have to answer. And Jesus answers nothing about it. He's not even going to acknowledge these things. Keeping quiet, picking up in verse 61. But he, Jesus, kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and says to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Caiaphas has reached a point. He knows he needs a conviction. And so I think he tries for a 1-2 punch. First, he wants to get a political charge against him. Now, it's not a capital offense to rise up and to say that you're the Messiah. Because at this point, we've already had several Jews in the 1st century BC and even into the 1st century AD who have already stood up and said, "I'm the Messiah, follow me," and whatnot. But Caiaphas does ask a second question, and that is, Are you the Christ? Here's the second question. The Son of the Blessed One. And that could also be translated, the Son of God. Now I have to call a timeout, and I have to ask you, Christian, when you hear Caiaphas, a first century, Second Temple, monotheistic Jew, ask, are you the Son of God? That phrase, Son of God, are you hearing the second person of the Trinity? Because if you are, you're adopting that phrase to mean what it means in the post-Christian era. You're listening to Paul, you're listening to John and some of the other writers of the New Testament, and you're listening to some of the second century Christianity that's wrestling with this issue and coming up with the identity of the Son of God and the second person of the Trinity being identical. But the person speaking here in Mark chapter 14, verse 61, is not a post-Christian thinker. This is Caiaphas, a first century, Second Temple, monotheistic Jew, asking Jesus, are you the Son of the Blessed One? Which doesn't mean, are you the second person of the Trinity? It means, do you make yourself equal with God? And look at Jesus' answer. Jesus answers him in verse 62. And Jesus says, I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. What did Jesus just say? Jesus said, Caiaphas, theologian, joining the ranks of Second Temple Jews, reading Second Temple literature, including the book of Daniel. And to this point, the book of Daniel has been very popular. And Jesus is making a reference to the book of Daniel, what we call Daniel chapter 7. They wouldn't have called it Daniel chapter 7. But in Daniel 7, we see this amazing vision. And here on earth, the powers that be are fighting with one another and fighting with everybody and trying to show that they're the true ruler of earth. They're going to be the almighty power. Well, up in heaven, the vision of a courtroom. And in this courtroom, thrones, plural, thrones are set up. And the Ancient of Days, that is God, takes his seat. And the rabbis and the pre-rabbinic writings asked, why are there thrones? Why isn't there just one throne where God is, of course, going to sit? But here in Daniel's vision, thrones are set up. The vision continues and we go back to planet Earth, where again the powers that be are fighting amongst each other and again trying to establish who's really going to be in control. We suddenly return to the heavenly vision, and there, one like a son of man enters the courtroom, enters and walks up to the Ancient of Days and takes his seat next to the Ancient of Days. And 1st century BC and 1st century AD, monotheistic Second Temple Jews wondered, who is this guy? Who is this person who's going to enter the presence of God? And not only is he going to enter the presence of God, but he's also going to sit next to God. And as the text continues, this person is giving God authority, power and might and ruling and so forth. And Jesus has just said to Caiaphas, you've been wondering who this guy is that's going to sit next to God. I'm him. But he also says one more thing. He says that you're going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. And here's the second thing. And coming with the clouds of heaven. This, once again, is one of the clearest references you could make to saying, I'm God. Because coming with the clouds of heaven is a position that God has. To come in judgment, just as seen in Psalms chapter 110, verse 1. Jesus has not only said that I'm that guy, I'm the Son of Man who's going to sit next to God, but I'm also going to come on the clouds of heaven in judgment. And just in case anybody thinks that Ozzy is taking the scriptures and twisting them to meet his theology, I want you to see what Caiaphas does. What Caiaphas does when Jesus says this. Verse 63, tearing his clothes, the high priest says, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? And they all condemned him worthy of deserving death. First century, Second Temple, monotheistic Jews heard Jesus' words and said, blasphemy. He has just made himself equal with God. Why? Because that's what the authors of Scripture have been trying to tell you throughout Matthew, throughout Mark, throughout Luke, throughout John. And just in case you won't hear it, listen to Jesus' own words, where he says that guy who's going to make himself equal with God and is going to receive power and dominion and rule, I'm him. And I'm going to come on the clouds of heaven in judgment. Jesus makes himself equal with God. Christian, if you're here this morning and I just introduced you to a new way of reading the text, reading the Gospels, I invite you to continue. I invite you to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not as standalone documents, not as where the story begins to get interesting, not as here's the good news. Everything that came before this has kind of been, old and decrepit and whatnot, and not that important. All of it has been important because all of it has been building up to this part of the story. And this part of the story wants you to see God interacting with His good creation. God coming into the world to interact with His creation and to return, just as was prophesied, to return to His temple. Now, perhaps you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus as God. And you don't understand the story. And you want to know more. Perhaps this has tickled your intellect. And it's interesting to you because maybe the Western Church hasn't presented the Gospels this way. And maybe you're interested and you want to continue this conversation. I'd be here and I'd be glad to continue this conversation with you. Because if you're not a believer and you don't know Jesus as both Lord, and hear that word there, Lord and Savior, this may be the morning for you to enter a relationship with Jesus, Lord and Savior.